Everyone at the Belmont Conservatory knew who Daniel was. How could they not? At just 28 years old, he had already become the youngest piano professor in the school's 100-year history. When he walked through the marble hallways, students would stop their conversations and watch him pass. Some whispered in admiration. Others just stared, hoping to catch a glimpse of the genius everyone talked about. Daniel's story seemed almost too perfect. He had graduated top of his class, won 3 international piano competitions before turning 25, and had performed in concert halls across Europe and America. Newspaper critics called his playing flawless and technically brilliant. One famous music magazine even wrote that listening to him play was like watching a perfectly programmed machine that somehow had a soul. But if you looked closely, you might notice something different about Daniel now compared to the young student he used to be. Back then, his eyes would light up whenever he sat at the piano. He would lose himself completely in the music, forgetting about time, forgetting about the audience, forgetting about everything except the melody flowing through his fingers. Now when he played, his eyes were cold and calculating. He counted every note, measured every pause, and always watched the audience's reaction. The change had happened slowly, so slowly that Daniel himself didn't notice it. Success had come so easily and so quickly that somewhere along the way, music stopped being about joy and started being about winning. Every performance became a competition. Every concert was another chance to prove he was better than everyone else. His students felt it most of all. When a young pianist would struggle with a difficult passage, Daniel would sigh with impatience instead of offering encouragement. "If you can't feel it naturally, maybe you're in the wrong profession," he once told a girl who had been practicing the same piece for weeks. She left his office in tears and quit the conservatory the next month. His colleagues at the conservatory were no different. In faculty meetings, Daniel would interrupt older professors to correct them or dismiss their teaching methods as outdated. "That's not how we do things anymore," he would say with a condescending smile. The other professors began avoiding him in the hallways, but none of this mattered to Daniel. He measured success in applause, in newspaper reviews, in the number of students who begged to study under him. And by those measurements, he was wildly successful. His greatest triumph, the piece that had made him truly famous, was a piano composition he called Echoes of Yesterday. It was beautiful, haunting, and unlike anything else being played in concert halls. The melody seemed to carry within it the weight of history, the sadness of lost time, the hope of memories preserved. When Daniel played it, audiences would sit in complete silence, some with tears running down their faces. Daniel told everyone that he had discovered fragments of this melody during his research into American folk music. He said he had spent months piecing together these forgotten tunes, reimagining them, transforming them into something new. "I found these dying echoes of our musical past," he would say in interviews, "and I gave them new life for modern audiences." The story was perfect. It made him seem not just talented but also culturally important. He wasn't just a pianist. He was a preserver of heritage, a bridge between the past and present. Universities invited him to lecture. Music foundations gave him grants to continue his research. And most importantly, Carnegie Hall booked him for a special solo performance in just 3 months, where Echoes of Yesterday would be the centerpiece of the evening. This Carnegie Hall concert was everything Daniel had been working toward. It would cement his reputation not just as a talented pianist, but as a true artist, a creator, someone who would be remembered long after his fingers could no longer play. He had already planned what he would wear, how he would bow, even which photographers he wanted to cover the event. In his private studio at the conservatory, Daniel would practice Echoes of Yesterday for hours every day. But something had been bothering him lately, though he refused to acknowledge it. Sometimes when he played the piece, he felt like something was missing. The notes were perfect, the timing was exact, but there was an emptiness at the center of the music that he couldn't quite fill. He blamed it on stress or fatigue. He told himself that once he performed it at Carnegie Hall, with the perfect acoustics and the prestigious audience, everything would come together. The emptiness would be filled. The missing piece would be found. His apartment was filled with awards and plaques, framed reviews and photographs of himself shaking hands with famous musicians. But there were no pictures of family, no mementos from his childhood. Nothing that connected him to the young boy who had first fallen in love with music at age 6, when his grandmother let him play her old upright piano. That boy had played for the pure joy of making sound, of discovering that pressing these keys in different combinations could create beauty out of silence. But that boy was gone now, buried under layers of ambition and pride. The conservatory's director had been asking Daniel to participate in their community outreach program. Every year, the school sent musicians to perform at local hospitals, schools, and senior centers. It was meant to give students real-world performance experience and to share music with people who couldn't attend expensive concerts. Daniel had avoided it for 3 years, always finding excuses. But this year, the director was insistent. "It's part of your duties as a faculty member," she said firmly. "Everyone participates, even you, Daniel." So finally, with great reluctance, Daniel agreed to perform at a senior living facility called Meadowbrook Gardens. He made it clear to everyone that he was only going because he had to. "I'll play for 30 minutes, he told the coordinator. "Nothing more. I have important practice to do." On the morning of the performance, Daniel barely looked at the program details. He didn't bother to learn about the facility or the people who lived there. To him, they were just an obligation to be checked off his list. He packed his music bag with simplified versions of famous pieces, nothing too complex, nothing that would require much effort or emotion. As he drove to Meadowbrook Gardens, he thought about his Carnegie Hall performance. He imagined the standing ovation, the reviews that would be written, the calls he would receive from even more prestigious venues. The senior center performance was just a distraction, a waste of an afternoon that he could have spent practicing. He had no idea that this afternoon would change everything. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, his perfectly constructed world would begin to crumble. He had no idea that an old man with weathered hands and kind eyes was waiting for him, carrying a truth that would shatter everything Daniel thought he knew about himself, about music, and about the price of pride. Daniel pulled into the parking lot of Meadowbrook Gardens, checked his reflection in the mirror one last time, and grabbed his music bag. He was the pride of the conservatory, the youngest professor, the creator of Echoes of Yesterday. He was untouchable, at least that's what he believed. Meadowbrook Gardens wasn't what Daniel expected. He had pictured a depressing place with white walls and the smell of medicine, but instead, he found a surprisingly cheerful building with large windows and colorful artwork on the walls. Residents sat in the common room, some in wheelchairs, others on comfortable couches, chatting quietly or reading newspapers. The activity coordinator, a woman named Beth, greeted him with too much enthusiasm for Daniel's taste. "Oh, we're so excited you're here. The residents have been looking forward to this all week. We don't often get professional musicians of your caliber." Daniel forced a smile and nodded, though inside he was already counting the minutes until he could leave. Beth led him to a small performance area where an old upright piano sat against the wall. It wasn't the grand Steinway he was used to at the conservatory. The bench was slightly wobbly and he could see scratches on the piano's dark wood surface. About 40 residents had gathered, along with a few staff members. They looked at him with genuine interest and appreciation, but Daniel barely noticed. He was too busy judging the piano, the room, the whole situation. This wasn't a real performance. This was charity work, something to be endured. He sat down at the piano without much of an introduction. "Good afternoon," he said briefly. "I'll be playing some classical pieces for you today." No warmth in his voice, no connection with the audience. Just words to get through so he could start playing and finish quickly. Daniel began with a simplified version of a Mozart sonata. His fingers moved across the keys with technical precision, hitting every note correctly, maintaining perfect tempo, but there was no heart in it. He was playing the way someone might read a grocery list, just getting through the items one by one. The residents clapped politely when he finished. Some smiled. A few looked a bit confused, as if they expected something different. Daniel didn't notice or care. He moved on to Chopin, then to Beethoven, playing each piece with the same mechanical efficiency. Halfway through his planned 30-minute set, Daniel glanced at his watch. 15 more minutes. He decided to play one more piece and call it done. He chose a simple folk tune arrangement, something even easier than what he'd been playing. His mind was already on the drive back to the conservatory, on the practice session he'd have that evening. When he finished his final piece, The applause was warm but not enthusiastic. Daniel stood up, gave a quick bow, and was already reaching for his music bag when Beth stepped forward. "That was wonderful. Would anyone like to ask our guest any questions?" An elderly woman in the front row raised her hand. "How long have you been playing piano, young man?" "Since I was 6, Daniel answered, his tone making it clear he wanted to wrap this up quickly. "Do you love it?" she asked, her eyes genuinely curious. The question caught Daniel off guard. "Do you love it?" When was the last time anyone had asked him that? When was the last time he'd asked himself? "Of course," he said automatically, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Before Beth could end the session, an old man in the back of the room slowly stood up. He was tall and thin, probably in his 80s, wearing a brown cardigan that had seen better days. His hands were weathered and marked with age spots, but his eyes were clear and kind. "Excuse me," the old man said softly. "Would it be all right if I played something?" "Just one song?" Daniel felt a flash of irritation. He wanted to leave. But Beth was already smiling and nodding. "Of course, Mr. Winters. Everyone. Thomas used to play piano professionally many years ago. Please, Thomas, go ahead." Daniel stepped aside reluctantly, not even trying to hide his impatience. He expected this old man to fumble through some simple tune, probably making mistakes, probably needing several tries to get through it, another delay before he could finally escape. Thomas moved slowly toward the piano, his steps careful but steady. He sat down on the bench and placed his hands gently on the keys. For a moment, he just sat there, eyes closed, as if gathering himself or remembering something precious. Then he began to play. The first few notes made Daniel freeze. His hand, which had been reaching for his jacket, stopped in midair. His breath caught in his throat. No, it couldn't be. But it was. Thomas was playing Echoes of Yesterday, Daniel's signature piece. The composition that had made him famous. The melody that was supposed to be his creation, his discovery, his gift to the world of music. But this wasn't how Daniel played it. This was different. Deeper. Richer. Thomas played with a tenderness that seemed to come from some place beyond technique, beyond practice. His weathered fingers moved across the keys with a familiarity that spoke of countless hours, countless years of knowing this music intimately. The room had gone completely silent. Even the staff members who had been quietly organizing chairs stopped what they were doing. Everyone was listening, truly listening. In a way they hadn't listened to Daniel's perfect but empty performance. Thomas played variations Daniel had never heard before, subtle changes in the melody that somehow made it more beautiful, more real. He played sections faster than Daniel ever had, then slower, following some internal rhythm that had nothing to do with what was written on sheet music and everything to do with what was felt in the heart. Daniel felt the blood draining from his face. His hands had gone cold. His carefully constructed world was tilting on its axis. How could this old man know this piece? How could he play it with such intimate knowledge, such deep understanding? The other residents were mesmerized. Some had tears in their eyes. An old woman in the front row was mouthing words as if the music carried lyrics she remembered. Another resident, a man who had seemed barely aware of his surroundings during Daniel's performance, was now fully present, nodding along to the melody. When Thomas reached the final section, the part Daniel always considered the most challenging, he played it with such effortless grace that it seemed like the simplest thing in the world. His hands seemed to know exactly where to go, as if they had played these notes 10,000 times before. The last note hung in the air, fading slowly into silence. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the room erupted in genuine, heartfelt applause. Not polite clapping, but real appreciation. The kind of applause Daniel used to receive before he became famous, before he stopped playing with his soul. Thomas opened his eyes and turned slightly on the bench. He looked directly at Daniel, and there was no anger in his gaze, no accusation, just a deep, profound sadness that cut through Daniel more sharply than any harsh word could have. "That's my father's song," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely audible over the continuing applause. "He wrote it in 1947, right after he came home from the war. I grew up listening to him play it every Sunday morning in our little house in West Virginia." The applause faded as people realized something significant was happening. Daniel stood frozen, unable to speak, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare at this old man who had just shattered his entire world. "My father never published it," Thomas continued, his voice still gentle. still kind. He just played it for us, for his family, for his friends in our town. He said music wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about healing, about remembering, about keeping the people we lost alive in our hearts. Beth looked confused, glancing between Thomas and Daniel. Some of the residents were whispering to each other. But Daniel heard nothing except the pounding of his own heart, the rushing of blood in his ears. Thomas slowly stood up from the piano bench. He walked over to Daniel, each step seeming to take forever. When he reached him, he didn't look angry or accusatory. He just looked sad. "I heard you play it on the radio last year," Thomas said. "I knew it immediately. Every note, every pause. My father's song. I wondered how it had found its way into the world after all these years. I thought maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I thought maybe you had found some recording, some old sheet music. I didn't think—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Daniel's mouth was dry. His mind was racing, trying to remember, trying to understand. 5 years ago, his research trip. That small town in Appalachia, the historical society with boxes of old recordings. He had told himself he was collecting public domain material, forgotten folk melodies that belonged to no one. He had convinced himself that what he was doing was preservation, not theft, but now, looking into Thomas's kind, sad eyes, all those rationalizations crumbled to dust. Daniel started, but his voice came out as a whisper. "I didn't know." But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He had known, maybe not consciously, maybe not admitting it to himself, but somewhere deep down he had known, and he had taken it anyway, because he wanted the fame, the recognition, the proof that he was special. Beth stepped forward, sensing the tension. "Is everything all right?" Thomas patted Daniel's shoulder gently, a gesture that somehow made everything worse. "It's all right," he said. "I'm just an old man remembering his father's music. Thank you for letting me play." He walked back to his seat slowly, leaving Daniel standing alone by the piano, his perfect world collapsing around him, and absolutely no idea what to do next. Daniel barely remembers driving back to the conservatory. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. His mind kept replaying the same moment over and over. Thomas sitting at that old piano, those weathered fingers moving across the keys. That melody, the one Daniel had claimed as his own, flowing out with a depth and authenticity he had never been able to capture. When he finally parked his car, he sat there for 10 minutes staring at nothing. Students walked past, laughing and talking, completely unaware that their celebrated professor's entire world had just crumbled. A few glanced at his car curiously, but he didn't even notice them. Eventually, Daniel forced himself to move. He went straight to his office, locked the door, and pulled out every file, every recording, every piece of research from his trip to West Virginia 5 years ago. His hands shook as he sorted through old notebooks, USB drives, and folders stuffed with papers. There, a small cassette tape labeled Appalachian Historical Society, Miscellaneous. Recordings 1940s, 1950s. Daniel hadn't looked at this in years. He had filed it away after extracting what he needed, telling himself it was just source material, just research, just forgotten folk melodies that belonged to everyone and no one. He found an old cassette player in the storage closet and plugged it in. The tape hissed and crackled as he pressed play. Voices from the past emerged, scratchy and distant. Someone talking about local history, a woman singing an old hymn. Then about 15 minutes in, he heard it, a piano playing. The recording quality was poor, but the melody was unmistakable. Echoes of yesterday in its original form, raw and real, and underneath the music, barely audible, a man's voice humming along. Then after the song ended, another voice speaking. "That was beautiful, Mr. Winters. Do you play that often?" "Every Sunday," came the reply. "Wrote it when I came back from Europe. Helps me remember the boys who didn't make it home." Daniel stopped the tape. His stomach turned. He had heard this recording 5 years ago. He remembered now. He had listened to it in his small research apartment, and something about the melody had grabbed him. It was beautiful, haunting, perfect, and nobody knew about it. The recording wasn't cataloged properly. There were no copyright notices. The Historical Society volunteer had just handed him a box of old tapes and said, "Feel free to digitize anything useful." He had told himself he was preserving history. He had told himself he was giving new life to forgotten music. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He had heard something beautiful that nobody else knew about, and he had taken it. He had changed it just enough to call it his own, added his own technical flourishes, polished it to perfection, and then he had built his entire reputation on it. Daniel put his head in his hands. The worst part wasn't even the theft itself. It was how easily he had justified it to himself. How quickly he had rewritten the story in his own mind until he actually believed he was the creator, the artist, the one who had reimagined these fragments into something new. His phone buzzed. A text from the conservatory director. "Great job at Meadowbrook today." The coordinator called to say the residents loved it, see? Community outreach isn't so bad, if only she knew. Daniel set his phone down and opened his laptop. He needed to understand the full scope of what he had done. He started searching for information about Thomas Winters, about his father, about West Virginia in the 1940s. What he found made everything worse. Articles from small-town newspapers, a mention in a veteran's newsletter from 1948 about a local piano player who performed for war survivors, a photograph from 1952 showing a man at a piano, children gathered around him. The caption read, "Local musician Robert Winters plays his original compositions for the community center's summer program." Robert Winters. Thomas's father, the real creator of Echoes of Yesterday. Daniel kept digging. He found an obituary from 1989. Robert Winters had died at age 73, having worked in coal mines for 40 years while playing piano on weekends and evenings. He had never pursued professional music, had never tried to publish his compositions. According to the obituary, he had believed music was a gift to be shared freely, not sold. The man had died without ever knowing that his son would one day hear his most precious composition being performed on the radio by a stranger who claimed to have written it. Daniel closed his laptop and sat in silence. The office walls were covered with his achievements. Framed concert programs, awards, photographs of him shaking hands with famous musicians, a poster advertising his upcoming Carnegie Hall performance with Echoes of Yesterday prominently featured as the evening's centerpiece. All of it was built on a lie. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an email notification. His heart sank as he read the subject line. "Check this out," from one of his students with a link to a video. With shaking hands, Daniel clicked the link. It was a video posted to social media just an hour ago. The title read, "Old Man plays famous pianist's signature piece, but he knew it first." The video showed Thomas at the Meadowbrook piano, playing Echoes of Yesterday with that same beautiful, authentic feeling. The person who posted it, apparently Thomas's grandson who worked at the senior center, had written a long caption explaining the whole story, how his great-grandfather had written the piece in 1947, how his grandfather had grown up with this music, how they had heard it on the radio last year and been shocked to hear someone else performing it. The video already had thousands of views. The comments section was exploding. People were tagging Daniel's name. Some were defending him, saying there must be an explanation. Others were accusing him of plagiarism. Music critics and journalists were chiming in, asking questions, demanding answers. Daniel's phone started ringing. The conservatory director. He didn't answer. It rang again. A reporter from a music magazine. Then another call. And another. He turned his phone off and sat in the growing darkness of his office as the sun set outside. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, was unraveling in real time. By tomorrow morning, this story would be everywhere. The investigation would begin. The cancellations would start. His career, his reputation, his future, all of it disappearing like smoke. But underneath all the panic and fear, there was something else. A small, quiet voice that had been trying to speak for years, ever since he had first taken that melody and claimed it as his own. The voice was getting louder now, impossible to ignore. It was the voice of the boy he used to be. The 6-year-old who had fallen in love with music, not because it could make him famous, but because it was beautiful. The boy who had played his grandmother's piano for hours not to impress anyone, just for the pure joy of making sound. That boy was ashamed of what Daniel had become. Around midnight, Daniel finally left his office. The hallways of the conservatory were empty and dark. He walked past practice rooms where he had taught countless students, past the concert hall where he had performed so many times, past photographs on the walls showing the school's history, its famous graduates, its proud tradition. He had wanted so desperately to be part of that tradition, to be remembered, to matter, and in his desperation, he had forgotten the only thing that actually mattered about music. It wasn't about him at all. When Daniel got home, he found he couldn't sleep. He sat at his own piano, the expensive grand piano in his apartment that cost more than most people's cars. He tried to play echoes of yesterday, but his fingers felt clumsy and false. Every note sounded hollow. Finally, at 3 a.m, he did something he hadn't done in years. He improvised. He just let his fingers move without thinking, without planning, without trying to impress anyone. The melody that emerged was simple and probably not very good. But it was his. Actually his. When he finished, he sat in the silence of his apartment and cried. Not just for his lost career, though that hurt. Not just for the shame that was coming, though that terrified him. He cried for all the years he had spent chasing the wrong things, for all the students he had discouraged, for all the music he had performed without really feeling, for the man he had become, and he cried for Thomas, who had heard his father's precious song on the radio, played by a stranger who had stolen it and never even said thank you. As the sun started to rise, Daniel made a decision. He didn't know if it would fix anything. He didn't know if anyone would forgive him or if he even deserved forgiveness. But he knew what he had to do. He had to face Thomas, not with lawyers or excuses or justifications, just as one human being to another, to finally tell the truth and accept whatever came next. Daniel took a shower, got dressed, and drove back to Meadowbrook Gardens as the city was waking up. His phone, which he had turned back on, was flooded with messages and missed calls. He ignored all of them. Some conversations couldn't wait. The receptionist at Meadowbrook Gardens looked surprised to see Daniel back so soon. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone cautious. She had probably already seen the video. "I need to speak with Thomas Winters," Daniel said. His voice was hoarse from lack of sleep. "It's important." The receptionist hesitated, studying his face. Finally, she picked up the phone and made a call. After a brief conversation, she hung up and gave Daniel a room number. "3rd floor. He says you can come up." Daniel's legs felt heavy as he climbed the stairs. He could have taken the elevator, but he needed the time to prepare himself, though he had no idea what he was going to say. How do you apologize for stealing someone's father's legacy? How do you make right something so fundamentally wrong? Thomas's apartment was small but neat. When he opened the door, he was wearing the same brown cardigan from yesterday. He looked tired, older somehow, but his eyes were still kind. He stepped aside without a word, letting Daniel enter. The apartment was filled with photographs. Family pictures covering every wall, every surface. Children, grandchildren, holidays, graduations. A life fully lived and deeply loved. On a small table by the window sat an old framed photograph of a man at a piano, surrounded by children. Daniel recognized him from the newspaper archives. "Robert Winters. That's my father," Thomas said quietly, noticing where Daniel was looking. "That picture was taken in 1952. I'm the little boy standing next to him. I was 8 years old." Daniel stared at the photograph. The boy in the picture was beaming up at his father with pure adoration. The kind of look that said this man was his hero, his whole world. "Please sit down," Thomas said, gesturing to a worn armchair. He took a seat on the couch across from Daniel. Between them sat a coffee table with 2 cups already prepared. Thomas must have made tea while waiting for him to come up. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Daniel's prepared words had all evaporated. Finally, he forced himself to look Thomas in the eye. "I stole your father's music," Daniel said. The words came out raw and simple. 5 years ago, I was in West Virginia doing research. The Historical Society gave me access to old recordings. I heard your father playing that song, and I took it. I told myself I was preserving it, that I was giving it new life, but that was all lies. I heard something beautiful, and I wanted it for myself. I wanted the credit, the recognition, so I took it, and I claimed it was mine." Thomas sat very still, his weathered hands folded in his lap. He didn't look angry. He just looked sad. "I'm sorry," Daniel continued, and his voice broke. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know sorry isn't enough, but I need you to know that I understand what I did. I didn't just steal a piece of music. I stole your father's voice. I stole your memories. I took something precious that he created from his pain and his love, and I used it to make myself famous. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Thomas took a slow breath and reached for his tea. He took a sip before speaking. "Do you know why my father wrote that song?" Daniel shook his head. He came back from the war in 1946, Thomas began, his voice soft with memory. He had been in Germany, saw terrible things. Lost friends. He came home different, quieter, had nightmares every night. My mother was worried about him. Then one day he sat down at our old piano, the one his own father had built by hand, and he started playing. He played for hours. When he finished, he had tears running down his face, but he was smiling. Thomas set down his teacup and looked at the photograph of his father. He told my mother that he finally found a way to say goodbye to the men who didn't come home. The music was his way of honoring them, of keeping their memory alive. Every Sunday morning he would play that song. It became a ritual. Our whole family would gather around the piano and he would play and we would remember. Not just the men who died, but the importance of peace, of family, of cherishing what we have. Daniel felt tears running down his own face now. I didn't know, he whispered. I never asked. I never tried to find out what it meant. That's because you weren't thinking about the music, Thomas said gently. You were thinking about yourself, about what the music could do for you. The words stung because they were absolutely true. My father died when I was 47, Thomas continued. Cancer. In his final weeks, when the pain was bad and the morphine made him confused, he would ask for the piano. We couldn't bring the piano to the hospice, but I would hold his hand and hum his songs to him. Especially that one. It brought him peace. It brought him home. Daniel covered his face with his hands. The weight of what he had done was crushing. He had turned something sacred into a commodity. He had performed this song in concert halls for applause, sold recordings for profit, used it to build his career, and all along, he had never once stopped to think about the man who created it, or what it had meant to him and his family. I'll give you everything, Daniel said desperately. All the money I made from the recordings, from the performances. I'll tell everyone the truth. I'll make sure your father gets credit. I'll do whatever you want. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Daniel didn't expect. I don't want your money. Daniel looked up confused. My father never cared about money, Thomas explained. He worked in the mines because he had to feed his family. But music was never about profit for him. It was about connection, about healing, about passing something meaningful to the next generation. He paused. If you give me money, what does that teach you? What does that change? Then what do you want? Daniel asked. Tell me how to make this right. Thomas leaned forward slightly. I want you to understand what music really is. Not just know it in your head, but feel it in your bones. My father always said that music without heart is just noise. He said that technique without soul is like a body without breath. Living, but not alive. He stood up and walked to a small bookshelf, pulling out an old wooden box. Inside were sheets of yellowed paper covered in handwritten musical notes. These are 3 other songs my father wrote. Nobody has ever played them except him and me. They've never been recorded, never been performed in public. Thomas held the box out to Daniel. I'm giving you permission to arrange these songs and perform them. But this time you have to do it right. You have to credit him. You have to learn about him. You have to understand what each song meant and why he wrote it. And you have to play them not for applause or fame, but to honor his memory and share his gift with the world the way he intended. Daniel stared at the box, afraid to touch it. Why would you trust me? After what I did? Because you came here, Thomas said simply. You didn't send lawyers. You didn't make excuses. You came here as one human being to another and you told the truth. That's a start. Maybe you can't be the person you were, but you can become someone better. Daniel carefully took the box, holding it like the precious thing it was. I don't deserve this. No, you don't, Thomas agreed. But my father believed in second chances. He believed that people could change if they truly wanted to. So I'm giving you the chance to prove him right. They talked for another hour. Thomas shared stories about his father, about growing up in a small West Virginia town, about Sunday mornings filled with music. Daniel listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time in years. He took notes not for research, but because he wanted to remember every detail, every story, every piece of the man behind the music. When Daniel finally stood to leave, Thomas walked him to the door. The road ahead won't be easy, Thomas said. People are angry. Your career will suffer. You'll face consequences. I know, Daniel said. I'm ready for that. Are you ready for something harder? Thomas asked. Are you ready to let go of being the star? To step back and let the music be more important than your name? Daniel thought about it honestly. I don't know, he admitted. "But I want to try." Thomas smiled for the first time since Daniel had arrived. "That's good enough for now." As Daniel drove away from Meadowbrook Gardens, the wooden box of sheet music carefully secured in the passenger seat, he knew his old life was over. The conservatory would probably fire him. Carnegie Hall had already canceled his performance. Music critics were calling him a fraud. He was facing investigations, lawsuits, public humiliation. But for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he had almost forgotten. Not pride or ambition or the hunger for recognition, just a quiet, simple desire to do something meaningful, to honor a man he had wronged, to play music not for himself, but for something larger. He didn't know if redemption was possible. He didn't know if anyone would forgive him, or if he could ever forgive himself. But he knew what his next step was. He had to face the consequences. He had to tell the truth publicly. And then, if he was lucky, if he worked hard enough and changed deeply enough, maybe someday he could play Thomas's father's songs the way they deserved to be played. With heart, with honesty, with gratitude for the gift that music really was. 18 months later, Daniel sat in the back row of the conservatory's recital hall. Not on stage where he used to perform, not in the front row where the distinguished professors sat. In the back where he could watch his students without drawing attention to himself. The journey to this moment had been brutal. The day after his conversation with Thomas, Daniel had called a press conference. Standing in front of cameras and reporters, his hands shaking, he had told the complete truth. He confessed to taking Robert Winters's composition, explained how he had rationalized the theft to himself, and took full responsibility for his actions. The fallout had been immediate and severe. Carnegie Hall permanently canceled his performance. Recording companies pulled his albums from stores. 3 universities revoked honorary degrees they had given him. The conservatory launched a formal investigation, and the board of directors met to discuss his future. Some colleagues wanted him fired immediately. They argued that his actions had damaged the school's reputation, and that keeping him on staff sent the wrong message. Others were more measured, suggesting that while what he did was wrong, his willingness to confess and take responsibility showed character. The director had given him a choice: resign quietly with a severance package or stay and face the consequences publicly. Daniel chose to stay. He accepted a formal reprimand, took a semester of unpaid leave, and when he returned, it was not as a professor. He came back as a teaching assistant, helping other instructors, supporting students, doing the work he should have been doing all along. The demotion was humiliating. Former colleagues avoided him in the hallways. Some students dropped his sections when they saw his name. Parents complained about having that plagiarist working with their children. Daniel endured it all, never defending himself, never making excuses. But slowly, something began to change. Not in how others saw him necessarily, but in how he saw music, teaching, and himself. Without the pressure of maintaining his reputation, without the constant need to prove he was the best, Daniel discovered something he had lost years ago. He rediscovered why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. He started actually listening to his students instead of just correcting them. When a young pianist struggled with a passage, Daniel would sit beside them and work through it patiently, finding ways to make it easier, encouraging them when they wanted to give up. He celebrated their small victories and helped them through their defeats. One student, a shy girl named Lily who was ready to quit because she didn't think she was talented enough, stayed because of Daniel's encouragement. "Talent is just the starting point," he told her. "Heart is what makes music real, and you have more heart than anyone I've ever taught." 6 months later, Lily performed her first solo recital. It wasn't technically perfect. She made mistakes, but she played with such genuine emotion that the audience gave her a standing ovation. Watching from the back row, Daniel had tears in his eyes. Not because of her performance, but because he finally understood what Thomas had been trying to teach him. Music wasn't about him. It had never been about him. During his journey of rebuilding, Daniel spent countless hours with Thomas. They met every Sunday morning, the same time Thomas's father used to play piano for his family. Thomas shared more stories, more memories, more of his father's history. Daniel took notes, asked questions, and slowly began to understand Robert Winters not as a source of stolen material, but as a real person who had lived, loved, suffered, and created. Daniel learned that Robert had proposed to his wife while playing piano at a church social, that he had taught himself to read music by studying library books, that he had written one song for each of his 4 children, capturing their personalities and melody, that he had never wanted fame, but had poured his whole heart into his music anyway. With Thomas's permission and guidance, Daniel began arranging the 3 unpublished compositions Robert had written. But this time everything was different. Every arrangement credited Robert Winters as the composer. Every note Daniel added or changed, he discussed with Thomas to make sure it honored the original intent. He wasn't trying to make the music his own. He was trying to be a faithful messenger of someone else's gift. Now, sitting in the recital hall 18 months after everything had fallen apart, Daniel was about to witness something important. The Conservatory had organized a special evening concert. The program listed 3 pieces by Robert Winters, arranged by Daniel, to be performed by advanced students, and Thomas had agreed to attend. The auditorium filled slowly. Students, faculty, some community members. Daniel saw Thomas enter, walking carefully with his grandson supporting his arm. They took seats in the middle section, and Thomas looked around with wonder. He had never been inside a professional concert hall before. The director walked onto the stage to make an announcement. She spoke about the Conservatory's commitment to honoring musical heritage and recognizing creators who had been overlooked by history. She told Robert Winters' story, his service in the war, his work in the coal mines, his gift for composition. She explained how his music had been wrongly taken but was now being rightfully restored to his name. Then she did something Daniel hadn't expected. She acknowledged his role in both the theft and the restoration. "We cannot change the past," she said, "but we can choose how we move forward." Daniel made a terrible mistake, but he also made the harder choice to face it honestly and work to make it right. That doesn't erase what he did, but it demonstrates that growth is possible. The first piece began. A student named Peter, one of the few who had continued working with Daniel despite the scandal, played a composition Robert had written for his oldest daughter. The melody was gentle and hopeful, full of a father's love. Thomas closed his eyes and listened, tears streaming down his face. Daniel could see him mouthing the words his father used to sing along with the music. The second piece was more complex, darker, clearly written during Robert's struggle with his war memories. A talented sophomore named Yuki performed it with remarkable sensitivity, capturing both the pain and the resilience in the composition. The audience sat in complete silence, absorbed. During the intermission, Daniel stayed in his seat while others mingled. He saw Thomas surrounded by people, all wanting to hear stories about his father. The old man looked overwhelmed but happy, finally able to share his father's legacy with the world. The third piece was scheduled to be performed by a guest artist, but at the last minute, the director approached Daniel. "Thomas asked if you would play this last one," she said quietly. "He said his father would have wanted the person who learned from their mistakes to be the one to play it." Daniel's heart raced. He hadn't performed publicly since the scandal. "I don't think I should," he said. "This evening isn't about me." "No, it's not," the director agreed. "It's about honoring Robert Winters. And sometimes honoring someone means accepting the grace they offer." When the lights dimmed for the second half, Daniel walked onto the stage for the first time in 18 months. The audience murmured in surprise. He sat at the piano and looked out at the crowd. His eyes found Thomas, who nodded encouragingly. Daniel began to play. The piece was called Morning After Storm, and Robert had written it about the hope of peace after war. Daniel played it not with the technical perfection he used to pride himself on, but with something more important. He played it with understanding, with respect, with gratitude. He made small mistakes. His fingers weren't as quick as they used to be after months away from performing. But those imperfections didn't matter. What mattered was that every note carried the weight of the lesson he had learned. That music was a gift to be shared, not a trophy to be claimed. That creativity belonged to something larger than any one person's ambition. When he finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Thomas stood up, starting the applause. Others followed, not because Daniel's performance was technically brilliant, but because they had witnessed something rare. They had seen someone who had fallen find their way back to what was real. After the concert, Daniel found Thomas in the lobby. The old man embraced him warmly. "My father would have been proud," Thomas said. Not of the performance, though it was beautiful, proud that his music helped someone find their way home. "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for giving me the chance to learn this." Thomas patted his shoulder. "You gave yourself that chance when you chose truth over pride." I just opened the door. As people filed out of the auditorium, several students approached Daniel. They didn't treat him like the celebrity he used to be. They treated him like a teacher, asking questions, seeking advice, sharing their own struggles with music. And Daniel listened to each one, giving them his full attention, finding joy in their growth rather than in his own recognition. Later that night, alone in his modest apartment, Daniel sat at his piano. Not the expensive grand piano he used to own. He had sold that months ago. This was a simple upright, old and slightly out of tune, but it was enough. He didn't play any famous compositions or practice for any performances. He just improvised, letting his fingers find melodies that came from somewhere honest inside him. The music wasn't perfect. It probably wasn't even very good. But it was real. And for the first time in more years than he could count, that was enough. Daniel had learned that being the pride of the conservatory meant nothing if you had no integrity. That applause was empty if you didn't deserve it. That true music came not from ambition but from authenticity. He would never be famous again. His name would always carry the stain of what he had done. But he had found something more valuable than fame. He had found a way to make music matter again. Not for himself, but for the students he taught, for the memories he helped preserve, and for the man whose grace had given him a second chance. Some songs aren't meant to make you famous. Some songs are meant to make you human again. And finally, after everything, Daniel understood the difference.